The rope bit deep into Michael Thompson's wrists as he hung against the pine tree, blood trickling down his forearms in thin, crimson streams. His camera lay shattered 20 feet away, lens glinting like broken promises in the dying September light. But instead of the violent end he expected, the massive gray wolf emerging from the shadows did something that defied every survival instinct he'd learned in 2 tours of Iraq. The beast approached with deliberate caution, golden eyes locked on Michael's face, and began methodically gnawing at the rope binding his left arm. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who would arrive 12 hours later, would drop her clipboard when she saw the security footage. Michael's grandfather had told him stories about wolves saving lost children, fairy tales he'd dismissed as folklore. The wolf's scarred muzzle worked patiently at the knots, each careful bite bringing Michael closer to freedom rather than death. "Jesus Christ, get the emergency wildlife team," Ranger Whitehorse would bark into his radio the next morning. "We've got a situation that's going to rewrite the textbooks." What had driven this apex predator to choose rescue over instinct? And would anyone believe what happened next? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 hours earlier, Michael Thompson had driven his battered Ford pickup through Yellowstone's north entrance with nothing but a camera bag, 3 days' worth of trail rations, and a prescription bottle he'd been avoiding for weeks. At 42, the former combat photographer carried the kind of quiet damage that showed in the careful way he moved through crowds and the way his eyes never stopped scanning for exits. The Iraq War had ended for most Americans in 2011. But for Michael, it replayed every night in dreams filled with the faces of his lost squad. Sergeant Danny Martinez, who'd been showing him pictures of his newborn daughter when the IED detonated. Corporal Lisa Chen, who'd saved his life twice before the roadside bomb claimed hers. The survivor's guilt had cost him his marriage, his staff position at National Geographic, and most nights, his sleep. His therapist at the VA hospital had suggested nature photography as a way to reconnect with beauty instead of death. "Find something worth preserving instead of documenting destruction," Dr. Amanda Foster had said during their last session. The suggestion had led him to Yellowstone's Specimen Ridge area, where elk migrations painted golden rivers across autumn meadows. Michael's plan was simple: spend 3 days alone in the backcountry, photograph the elk herds, and maybe find some peace in the wilderness that had always been his refuge. He'd grown up hunting with his grandfather in Montana's Bitterroot Mountains, learning to read animal tracks and weather patterns before he could properly tie his boots. Those skills had kept him alive in Iraq, and he hoped they might help him find a way to live with what he'd brought home. The wolf he would soon encounter had his own story of survival and loss. Known to the park's research team as Wolf 1247M, locals called him Phantom for his ability to appear and disappear without warning. At 8 years old, he was ancient by wolf standards, a battle-scarred survivor of territorial fights and harsh winters. His pack had perished in the previous year's wildfire, leaving him to wander alone through territory that once rang with the howls of his family. Dr. Elena Rodriguez had been tracking Phantom for 2 years, documenting his unusual behavior patterns and his apparent reluctance to join other packs. What she didn't know was that the wolf's isolation mirrored that of a troubled veteran who would soon cross his path, and that their meeting would challenge everything science thought it knew about the emotional lives of wild animals. The afternoon sun filtered through the lodgepole pines as Michael adjusted his telephoto lens, watching a bull elk bugle across the meadow. The haunting sound echoed off the canyon walls, a wild music that seemed to reach something deep inside his chest that had been silent for too long. For the first time in months, the constant hum of anxiety in his mind had quieted to a whisper. He was kneeling behind a fallen log, camera clicking steadily, when he heard voices approaching from the trail behind him. Two men emerged from the tree line, both wearing hunting gear despite being in a photography zone. The larger man had the weathered face of someone who spent most of his time outdoors, while his companion looked nervous, constantly checking over his shoulder. "Afternoon," the big man called out, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Name's Derek Morrison, but everyone calls me Diesel. This here's Bobby Crane. You wouldn't happen to have seen any rangers come through here today, would you?" Michael lowered his camera, his military instincts picking up something off about the pair. Diesel's boots were caked with mud from areas that should have been dry this time of year, and Bobby kept fidgeting with something in his jacket pocket. "Haven't seen anyone since I left the trailhead this morning. You fellas lose your way?" "Not exactly," Diesel said, his tone shifting to something harder. "We're actually wondering about that fancy camera of yours. Been taking a lot of pictures today?" The question sent alarm bells ringing in Michael's head. He'd photographed nothing but elk and landscape, but these men seemed concerned about what his camera might have captured. Just wildlife photography, nothing that would interest anyone. Bobby stepped forward, his nervousness giving way to desperation. "Look, mister, we don't want any trouble, but we need to see what's on that memory card. Maybe delete a few shots if you caught something you shouldn't have." Michael's combat training kicked in as he assessed the situation. Two men, likely armed, in a remote area where no one would hear a gunshot. He palmed the knife clipped to his belt while keeping his voice calm. "I told you I've only been photographing elk. Whatever you're worried about, it's not on my camera." Diesel's facade dropped completely. "Here's the thing, soldier boy. Yeah, I can tell what you are by the way you carry yourself. Bobby and I have been running trap lines in this area for the better part of a year, catching wolves mostly. Good money in their pelts if you know the right buyers." The admission hit Michael like a physical blow. Wolf poaching was a federal crime, punishable by massive fines and prison time. These men weren't just breaking the law, they were destroying one of Yellowstone's most important predator populations. "Now, I'm thinking a combat photographer might have some real nice telephoto shots of areas we've been working," Diesel continued, pulling a pistol from his waistband. "Can't have that kind of evidence floating around, can we?" Michael's muscle memory from Iraq took over. He rolled left behind the log as Bobby lunged for his camera, coming up with his knife in a reverse grip. The blade caught Bobby across the forearm, sending him stumbling backward with a cry of pain. But Diesel was ready for resistance. The gun barrel caught Michael across the temple, stars exploding across his vision as he dropped to his knees. Before he could recover, Bobby had tackled him from behind, and both men were wrestling him toward a massive pine tree. "Should have just cooperated," Diesel muttered as they bound Michael's wrists with paracord. "Now we've got a real problem." "Can't let you walk out of here knowing what you know." As they secured him to the tree, Michael fought against the ropes until his wrists bled. His camera lay smashed nearby, memory card missing along with his GPS unit and emergency beacon. The men had been thorough. "Here's what's going to happen," Diesel said, checking his watch. "We're going to finish our work tonight, pack up our operation, and be gone by morning. Then we'll come back and make sure you can't tell anyone what you saw. Bobby here thinks we should just shoot you now, but I'm not a murderer. Hypothermia is more natural, don't you think?" Bobby looked sick at his partner's casual discussion of murder. "Diesel, maybe we should just..." "Should just what? Let him walk to the Rangers and describe us? Use that military training to hunt us down?" Diesel shook his head. "No, this is the only way. Come morning, this'll just look like another tourist who got lost and didn't make it through the night." As their voices faded into the forest, Michael tested the ropes binding him to the ancient pine. They were expertly tied, and struggling only made them tighter. The temperature was already dropping with the sun, and he was wearing only a light jacket over his cotton shirt. By dawn, if the cold didn't kill him, Diesel would return to finish the job. The forest grew darker as evening settled over Yellowstone, and Michael's situation became increasingly desperate. The paracord cut deeper into his wrists with every movement, and the September night air carried the promise of temperatures that could drop into the 30s. His light jacket provided little protection against the creeping cold that seemed to seep through his bones. He'd tested every knot, tried twisting his hands through impossible angles, and even attempted to scrape the rope against the rough bark of the pine tree. Nothing worked. Diesel had known what he was doing when he'd tied those knots. Michael's military training included escape and evasion techniques, but those assumed you had some mobility, some leverage to work with. Bound upright against the tree trunk, he had neither. The sounds of the forest shifted as darkness fell. The elk had moved on, their bugles replaced by the distant hoots of great horned owls and the scurrying of small creatures through the undergrowth. Michael forced himself to stay alert, fighting the hypothermia that would dull his mind and slow his reactions. If he was going to die here, he'd at least die conscious and fighting. That's when he heard it, a sound that made every hair on his neck stand up. The soft padding of large paws on pine needles, moving with the deliberate caution of a predator. Michael's breath caught in his throat as yellow eyes materialized in the darkness, reflecting the pale moonlight like twin flames. The wolf was massive, easily 140 pounds, with the broad chest and powerful shoulders of an alpha male. But it was the scars that caught Michael's attention, deep furrows across the left side of the animal's face and neck, the kind of wounds that spoke of survival against impossible odds. This wasn't just any wolf. This was a warrior who had fought battles and lived to tell the tale. For several long minutes, predator and human simply stared at each other. Michael's military training screamed at him to make himself appear larger, to shout and intimidate the animal into retreat. But something in those golden eyes stopped him. There was intelligence there, yes, but also something else. A recognition of suffering that seemed almost human. The wolf circled him slowly, keeping its distance but never breaking eye contact. Michael could hear the animal's breathing, see the slight limp in its gait that suggested old injuries. When it finally approached close enough to touch, Michael held his breath, certain that death was moments away. Instead, the wolf lowered its massive head and began examining the ropes binding Michael's wrists. Its nose, black and wet, traced the paracord with scientific precision. Then, impossibly, the animal began to work at the knots with its teeth. Michael watched in stunned silence as the wolf's canines, designed to tear flesh from bone, carefully manipulated the rope fibers. The animal worked with the patience of a surgeon, never biting hard enough to snap the cord but applying steady pressure to loosen the knots. Each strand that gave way brought a small whimper of relief from Michael, whose hands had gone numb hours ago. The process took nearly an hour. The wolf would work for several minutes, then step back and circle the tree, as if assessing its progress from different angles. During these breaks, Michael found himself studying the animal's scars more closely. Burns, he realized. The distinctive pattern of tissue damage spoke of exposure to intense heat. This wolf had survived a wildfire, probably the massive blaze that had swept through this region the previous summer. When the rope on his left wrist finally gave way, Michael nearly sobbed with relief. The wolf stepped back, watching as he worked, feeling back into his hand, and began attacking the remaining knots. With one hand free, the rest was simply a matter of time and determination. As circulation returned to his extremities, Michael studied his unlikely savior. The animal sat on its haunches a few feet away, head tilted slightly as if waiting for something. In the moonlight, Michael could see the wolf's ribs showing beneath its fur, evidence of the hard life of a loner without a pack to help with hunting. "Why?" Michael whispered, his voice hoarse from hours of silence. "Why did you help me?" The wolf's ears perked forward at the sound of his voice, and for a moment, Michael could have sworn he saw understanding in those golden eyes. Not the simple intelligence of a domestic dog responding to human speech, but something deeper, a recognition of shared experience, perhaps. Two scarred survivors who had both lost their pack, their family, their sense of purpose. Michael slowly reached into his jacket pocket, grateful that Diesel and Bobby had been more interested in his camera and GPS than his trail food. He pulled out a protein bar and carefully unwrapped it, then broke off a piece and tossed it toward the wolf. The animal sniffed the offering but didn't eat it immediately. Instead, it seemed to consider the gesture as if understanding that sharing food was a sign of trust, of acceptance into a temporary pack of two. When it finally ate the protein bar, it was with delicate care, never taking its eyes off Michael. Standing was agony. Hours of being bound upright had left Michael's legs cramped and unsteady. But the wolf rose too, and began walking slowly toward the tree line. After a few steps, it paused and looked back, its message clear: "Follow me." Every instinct Michael possessed told him this was insane. Following a wild predator through unfamiliar terrain in the dark violated every rule of wilderness survival. But as he looked into those intelligent eyes, he realized he was no longer thinking about survival in traditional terms. This wasn't about human versus nature, civilization versus wilderness. This was about two damaged souls recognizing something essential in each other. Michael took a step toward the wolf, then another. The animal waited until he was close enough to follow its movement, then began padding silently through the forest. As they walked together through the moonlit pines, Michael understood that his rescue was far from over. Diesel and Bobby would return at dawn, and when they found him gone, the hunt would begin in earnest. But for now, he wasn't alone. The wolf moved through the forest with the silent efficiency of a creature born to these mountains, and Michael struggled to match its fluid grace. His combat boots, designed for desert terrain, felt clumsy on the pine needle carpet that seemed to swallow every sound the wolf made. The animal paused frequently, allowing Michael to catch up, its golden eyes constantly scanning the darkness for threats neither of them could afford to ignore. They traveled for what felt like hours, following game trails and creek beds that Michael would never have found on his own. The wolf seemed to know exactly where it was going, leading them steadily northwest toward the heart of the park's backcountry. During one rest stop beside a small stream, Michael knelt to drink and watched his unlikely guide do the same just a few feet upstream. "You know this country better than any map," Michael whispered, and the wolf's ears swiveled toward him at the sound of his voice. There was something almost conversational in the gesture, as if the animal understood that Michael was making an observation rather than a command. The temperature continued to drop as the night deepened, and Michael's light jacket provided little protection against the mountain air. He was beginning to shiver when the wolf did something that defied every assumption about wild animal behavior. The creature settled down in a small clearing and began to groom itself, but positioned so that its body blocked the wind from reaching Michael. Understanding the invitation, Michael carefully approached and sat with his back against a large boulder, the wolf's warm bulk creating a windbreak just a few feet away. Neither touched the other, but the shared warmth was enough to stop Michael's shivering. As they rested, he studied the animal's scars more closely in the moonlight. The burns covered nearly a quarter of the wolf's body, concentrated on the left side where flames had apparently caught it during its escape from the wildfire. The injuries had healed, but they told a story of desperate survival, of an animal that had lost everything and somehow found the will to keep going. Michael recognized that story because he'd been living his own version of it since Iraq. "We're both survivors, aren't we?" he said softly. The wolf's eyes met his, and Michael saw something there that made his throat tighten. Not the simple awareness of a wild animal, but the deeper recognition of shared experience. Both of them carried scars. Both had lost their pack, Both were trying to find their way through a world that no longer made complete sense. The moment was broken by a sound that made both man and wolf freeze. Voices in the distance, Diesel and Bobby apparently returning earlier than expected. The wolf rose immediately, its body language shifting from relaxed to alert. Michael could see the animal's nostrils flaring as it tested the wind, reading information in the night air that remained invisible to human senses. Moving with renewed urgency, the wolf led Michael away from the approaching voices. They climbed steadily upward, following a ridgeline that offered natural concealment among the rocky outcroppings. Behind them, Michael could hear the poachers' voices growing louder as they discovered his escape. "Son of a bitch got loose," Diesel's voice carried through the trees. "Track him. Can't have gone far with his hands torn up like that." The wolf seemed to understand the danger perfectly. It led Michael along paths that crossed rocky ground where footprints wouldn't show, through creek beds that would mask their scent, and around terrain features that would hide them from pursuit. The animal's tactical awareness impressed Michael, who recognized similar techniques from his military training. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky pale gray, the wolf brought them to an overlook that provided a view of the valley below. Michael could see two figures with flashlights moving through the forest, searching in a grid pattern that showed professional knowledge of tracking techniques. Diesel hadn't been lying about his outdoor experience. "They know what they're doing," Michael murmured, and the wolf pressed closer to him, its presence somehow reassuring despite the circumstances. The animal seemed to be studying the searchers too, its intelligent eyes tracking their movement patterns. That's when the wolf did something that amazed Michael even more than the rescue. The animal began to move in a wide circle around their position, deliberately leaving tracks in soft soil and disturbed vegetation. But the trail it created led away from Michael's hiding place, toward a series of steep ravines that would be treacherous to navigate. Understanding dawned on Michael as he watched his protector work. The wolf was creating a false trail, using its own scent and tracks to mislead the pursuers. It was a sophisticated deception that required forward thinking and an understanding of human tracking methods that should have been impossible for a wild animal. When the wolf returned to the overlook, it carried something in its mouth, a rabbit, freshly killed and still warm. The animal dropped the prey at Michael's feet, then settled down to watch him with expectant eyes. The meaning was clear: food shared between pack members. Michael's stomach clenched with hunger. He hadn't eaten since the previous morning, and his body needed fuel to recover from the night's ordeal. But the thought of eating raw rabbit meat made him hesitate. The wolf seemed to sense his reluctance and began to tear strips of meat from the carcass, demonstrating that the food was safe and necessary. Using his knife, Michael managed to create a small fire using techniques learned in survival training. The wolf watched with interest as he cooked portions of the rabbit, never showing fear of the flames despite its obvious history with fire. When the meat was done, Michael offered a piece to the wolf, who accepted it with what seemed like gratitude. As they shared the meal in the growing daylight, Michael felt a connection forming that went beyond simple survival cooperation. This wasn't just an animal helping a human or vice versa. This was a partnership between two damaged individuals who had found something valuable in each other's company. The sound of breaking branches interrupted their breakfast. The false trail had worked, but only temporarily. Diesel and Bobby were climbing toward their position, having apparently figured out the deception. The wolf rose immediately, its hackles beginning to rise as it faced the direction of the approaching threat. "Easy," Michael whispered, checking his knife and looking for escape routes. "We're not done yet." The voices were getting closer now, and Michael could hear Bobby's labored breathing as the two men climbed the steep slope. They were maybe 50 yards away and closing fast. The wolf looked at Michael, then at the approaching danger, and Michael could see the animal making a decision. Instead of fleeing, the wolf moved to position itself between Michael and the threat, its lips pulled back to reveal impressive canines, and a low growl rumbled from deep in its chest. The sound was unlike anything Michael had ever heard, not the simple aggression of an angry animal, but the controlled threat of a trained warrior choosing its battlefield. "This is insane," Michael whispered, but he found himself moving to stand beside the wolf rather than fleeing. Two survivors preparing to face their enemies together. The morning sun broke through the trees just as Diesel and Bobby emerged from the forest below them, and Michael got his first clear look at his captors in daylight. Diesel was bigger than he'd appeared in the darkness, with the thick build of a man who'd spent his life doing physical labor. Bobby looked exhausted and scared, clearly in over his head but too committed to back out now. Both men stopped short when they saw the wolf standing beside Michael, its golden eyes fixed on them with unmistakable hostile intent. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Diesel slowly reached for the pistol at his hip. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of surprise and dark amusement. "Looks like our lost photographer found himself a guard dog. Too bad wolves don't stop bullets." The wolf's growl deepened, and Michael felt the animal's muscles bunching beneath its scarred coat. Whatever was about to happen, they would face it together. The partnership that had begun with cut ropes in the darkness was about to be tested by violence in the light of day. Michael gripped his knife and prepared to discover whether the bond between a damaged veteran and a lone wolf could survive against armed men who had already proven they were willing to kill. The standoff lasted only seconds before Diesel made his move, drawing his pistol with practiced speed. But the wolf was faster. The animal launched itself forward in a blur of gray fur and flashing teeth, covering the 20-foot distance between them before Diesel could fully raise his weapon. The impact knocked Diesel backward, his shot going wild as he struggled to keep the snapping jaws away from his throat. The wolf's attack was precise and controlled, meant to disarm rather than kill. Its powerful jaws clamped down on Diesel's gun hand, applying just enough pressure to force him to drop the weapon without breaking bones. Bobby scrambled for the fallen pistol, but Michael was already moving. His combat training kicked in as he tackled the smaller man, using his weight advantage to pin him to the rocky ground. "Stay down," Michael commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life-or-death situations. The wolf released Diesel's hand and backed away, positioning itself where it could watch both men while staying close enough to Michael to provide protection. The animal's tactical awareness continued to impress Michael. It understood that neutralizing the immediate threat was only the first step in a larger battle. Diesel clutched his bleeding hand and stared at the wolf with a mixture of rage and grudging respect. "That's no ordinary animal," he said, his voice tight with pain. "Wolves don't fight like that. They don't think like that." "You're right," came a voice from the tree line. Dr. Elena Rodriguez emerged from the forest, followed by Ranger Jim Whitehorse and two other Park Service officers. All four were armed, but their weapons remained holstered as they assessed the scene. "That's not an ordinary wolf. That's Wolf 1247M, designation Phantom, and he's been exhibiting extraordinary behavior for over 2 years." Michael felt a wave of relief wash over him as the cavalry arrived, but he kept his position, pinning Bobby to the ground. The wolf, Phantom, remained alert but showed no aggression toward the newcomers, seeming to understand that they represented help rather than threat. Dr. Rodriguez approached slowly, her eyes fixed on Phantom with scientific fascination. "In 30 years of wildlife research, I've never seen anything like what just happened here. Wolves don't normally intervene to protect humans, especially not with this level of tactical sophistication." Ranger Whitehorse moved to secure Diesel, applying flex cuffs to both poachers while keeping a wary eye on Phantom. Dr. Rodriguez got worried when your emergency contact called yesterday saying you'd missed your check-in. We've been searching since dawn. As the immediate danger passed, Michael finally allowed himself to relax slightly. But Phantom remained vigilant, his scarred head turning constantly to monitor the surrounding forest. The wolf's behavior suggested he understood that Diesel and Bobby might not be working alone. "There's something else you need to know," Bobby said suddenly, his voice cracking with fear and exhaustion. "Diesel's got partners. 3 more men working different sections of the park. They've been running trap lines for months, taking wolves, elk, even bears. There's a whole operation." Dr. Rodriguez's expression darkened. "How many wolves have you killed?" Diesel spat blood and glared at her. "Enough to make a living. Those animals are nothing but overgrown rats anyway. Park's got too many of them." The comment triggered something in Phantom. The wolf's lips pulled back in a silent snarl, and he took a step toward Diesel before Michael's quiet, "Easy, boy," stopped him. The exchange didn't go unnoticed by Dr. Rodriguez, who was taking mental notes of every interaction between man and wolf. "We need to get you medical attention," she said to Michael, noting the rope burns on his wrists and the exhaustion in his eyes. "And we need to document everything that happened here. This could be the most important interspecies cooperation event ever recorded." As Ranger Whitehorse radioed for backup and medical assistance, Dr. Rodriguez carefully approached Phantom. The wolf watched her with interest but no hostility, seeming to understand that she meant no harm. "I've been studying him for 2 years," she told Michael quietly. "His pack died in the Maple Creek fire last summer. All 6 members, including his mate and 2 pups. He's been alone ever since." The information hit Michael like a physical blow. No wonder Phantom had recognized something in him. They were both survivors carrying the weight of lost families. How has he survived on his own? "That's what's so remarkable," Dr. Rodriguez replied. "Lone wolves usually die within months. They need pack cooperation to hunt large prey. But Phantom has not only survived, he's thrived. He's developed hunting techniques I've never seen before, and his territory is larger than most pack ranges." Phantom seemed to sense they were discussing him. The wolf approached Michael and sat beside him, close enough that Michael could feel the animal's warmth. The gesture was unmistakably protective, claiming Michael as part of his temporary pack. "This changes everything we know about wolf behavior," Dr. Rodriguez continued, her scientific excitement evident despite the circumstances. "The level of reasoning he's displayed, the tactical thinking, the apparent empathy, it suggests cognitive abilities far beyond what we've previously documented." Diesel laughed bitterly from where he sat, cuffed against a tree. "You people are insane. It's just an animal acting on instinct. There's nothing special about it." But even as he spoke, Phantom did something that undermined his argument completely. The wolf rose and walked to where Michael's shattered camera lay among the rocks. Carefully, using his teeth, he picked up the camera's memory card, which had somehow survived the destruction, and brought it to Dr. Rodriguez. The gesture was deliberate and purposeful. Phantom had observed the human's interest in the device and understood its importance as evidence. He was actively participating in ensuring the poachers would face justice for their crimes. "My God," Dr. Rodriguez whispered, accepting the memory card from the wolf's gentle jaws. "He understands cause and effect, evidence, even justice in some form. This is unprecedented." As if responding to her amazement, Phantom returned to Michael's side and pressed his scarred muzzle against the man's hand. The contact was brief but meaningful. A wolf choosing to trust a human completely, despite every evolutionary instinct warning against such behavior. The sound of approaching helicopters filled the morning air as backup arrived. Phantom's ears perked at the noise, and he looked to Michael as if seeking reassurance. "It's okay," Michael said softly, stroking the wolf's head. "They're here to help." But as the helicopters landed and more people emerged from the aircraft, Phantom began to back away. The wolf's wild instincts were reasserting themselves in the face of so many humans. Michael felt a stab of panic at the thought of losing his protector. "He's going to run," Dr. Rodriguez observed. "Too many people. Wolves can only tolerate so much human contact before their flight response kicks in." Michael stood slowly, keeping his movements calm and non-threatening. Phantom watched him with those intelligent golden eyes, and Michael could see the internal struggle playing out in the animal's posture. The desire to stay with his new packmate warred with millions of years of evolution, warning him to flee. "Thank you," Michael said simply, his voice carrying all the gratitude he couldn't adequately express. "You saved my life in more ways than one." Phantom tilted his head, studying Michael's face as if memorizing it. Then, in a gesture that brought tears to Michael's eyes, the wolf lowered his head in what could only be interpreted as a farewell bow. Without another sound, Phantom melted into the forest, disappearing among the trees as if he had never been there at all. But the evidence of his presence remained in Michael's life, in Dr. Rodriguez's data, and in the memory card that would help convict a ring of wildlife poachers. As the medical team checked Michael for injuries and the law enforcement officers processed the crime scene, Dr. Rodriguez stood staring at the forest where Phantom had vanished. "What happens now?" Michael asked her. "Now we try to understand what we've witnessed," she replied, "and we make sure that remarkable animal is protected. Because something tells me this isn't the last we'll see of Wolf 1247M. Animals that form bonds like that don't forget." In the distance, barely audible over the helicopter noise, came the sound Michael had been hoping to hear. A long, mournful howl that seemed to say goodbye and promise reunion all at once. 3 weeks later, Michael Thompson sat in the witness chair of a federal courtroom in Cheyenne, Wyoming, his hands still bearing faint scars from the rope burns. The prosecution had built a solid case against Derek Morrison and Bobby Crane, but it was Michael's testimony that would determine whether the jury understood the full scope of what had happened in those woods. "Mr. Thompson," the prosecutor began, "in your professional opinion as a combat photographer, was the wolf's behavior consistent with normal predatory instincts?" Michael looked across the courtroom at Diesel, who sat flanked by his defense attorneys. The man's face was a mask of contempt, but Michael could see fear lurking beneath the surface. "No, ma'am. What that wolf did required reasoning, planning, and an understanding of cause and effect that went far beyond instinct." The defense attorney objected, arguing that Michael wasn't qualified to interpret animal behavior, but Judge Patricia Hendricks overruled. The memory card Phantom had retrieved contained irrefutable evidence of the poaching operation, including photos of illegal trap lines and stockpiled wolf pelts worth over $200,000. Dr. Elena Rodriguez testified next, presenting 2 years of research data on Wolf 1247M. Her scientific credibility lent weight to Michael's account, transforming what might have seemed like a tall tale into documented fact. The cognitive abilities displayed by this individual wolf represent a significant anomaly, she told the jury. "We're dealing with an animal that has learned to process complex information and make strategic decisions." But it was Bobby Crane's testimony that truly devastated the defense. Facing federal charges that could send him to prison for 20 years, he'd agreed to cooperate fully with prosecutors. Through tears, he described how Diesel had recruited him when his construction company went bankrupt, promising easy money from wealthy collectors who paid premium prices for illegal wildlife products. "Diesel told me wolves were just vermin," Bobby said, his voice barely audible. "Said they killed livestock and spread disease, that we were doing ranchers a favor. But when I saw that animal save Mr. Thompson, saw the intelligence in its eyes, I knew we'd been killing something that deserved better." The revelation that shook Michael most deeply came when Bobby described Diesel's true motivation. The poaching operation wasn't just about money. It was personal revenge. Diesel's father had been killed by wolves in Alaska 30 years earlier, and Diesel had spent his adult life hunting their kind in retaliation. He hated them, Bobby testified, said every wolf he killed was payback for his dad. The money was just a bonus. He would have done it for free. During cross-examination, Diesel's attorney tried to paint the wolf's intervention as coincidence, suggesting that the animal had simply been investigating potential carrion when it encountered Michael. But the prosecution had prepared for this argument. They played audio recordings Dr. Rodriguez had captured of Phantom's vocalizations over the past 2 years, comparing them to the sounds Michael remembered from their night together. The wolf was communicating with Mr. Thompson, Dr. Rodriguez explained to the jury. These low-frequency whines and soft barks are typically used between pack members to coordinate movement and express concern. The wolf had essentially adopted Mr. Thompson into his social structure. The trial's most dramatic moment came when Diesel himself took the stand. His attorney had advised against testifying, but Diesel's arrogance overruled caution. He wanted his day in court, his chance to justify his actions. "Those animals killed my father," he told the jury, his voice rising with emotion. "Tore him apart while he was checking trap lines in the Yukon. I was 16, and I had to identify what was left of him. You want to talk about trauma? Try living with that image for 30 years. Michael felt a stab of unexpected sympathy for the man who had tried to kill him. Diesel's pain was real, his loss genuine, but it didn't excuse what he'd done. "So you decided to declare war on an entire species?" the prosecutor pressed. "I decided to fight back," Diesel replied. "Wolves are killers. They don't think or feel or reason like that scientist claims. They're predators, plain and simple. The fact that one of them happened to help this man doesn't change what they are." The prosecutor's next question cut to the heart of the case. "Mr. Morrison, if wolves are such mindless killers, how do you explain Wolf 1247M's behavior? How do you explain an animal choosing to save a human life?" For the first time since taking the stand, Diesel seemed uncertain. It was probably just curious. Maybe smelled food on him. Animals do weird things sometimes." But this wasn't weird behavior, was it? Dr. Rodriguez has documented this wolf's actions for 2 years. It's shown problem-solving abilities, emotional responses to loss, and now protective behavior toward a human. Doesn't that suggest these animals are more complex than you're willing to admit? Diesel's facade cracked. "It doesn't matter how smart they are," he shouted. "Smart or stupid, they're still killers. They still destroyed my family." Judge Hendricks called for order as Diesel's outburst echoed through the courtroom. In that moment of raw emotion, Michael saw not a hardened criminal, but a broken man who had spent 3 decades consumed by grief and rage. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Diesel was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, while Bobby received 5 years with the possibility of parole after 2. The judge's closing remarks addressed the broader implications of the case. "This court recognizes that we are dealing with more than simple wildlife crimes," Judge Hendricks said. "The evidence presented suggests that our understanding of animal consciousness and behavior may need significant revision. While this court cannot rule on matters of scientific theory, we can and must protect creatures that demonstrate such remarkable intelligence and capacity for connection." As the courtroom cleared, Dr. Rodriguez approached Michael. "There's something I need to tell you," she said quietly. "We've been monitoring Phantom since the incident. His behavior has changed again." He started approaching park boundaries as if he's looking for something or someone. Michael's heart raced. You think he's looking for me? I think he formed a bond that night that goes deeper than anything we've previously documented. The question is, what do we do about it? That evening, as Michael sat in his hotel room reviewing his notes for the book he was planning to write about the experience, his phone rang. The caller ID showed Dr. Rodriguez's number. Michael, you need to get to the park immediately, her voice was urgent. Phantom's in trouble, real trouble, and I think you might be the only one who can help him. The line went dead, leaving Michael staring at his phone with a growing sense of dread. His wolf, for he'd come to think of Phantom that way, needed him. The partnership that had begun with cut ropes in the darkness was about to face its greatest test yet. Outside his hotel window, storm clouds were gathering over the mountains, and Michael couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was just beginning. Michael drove through the night, his truck's headlights cutting through the darkness as he raced toward Yellowstone. Dr. Rodriguez's urgent call had provided few details, only that Phantom was trapped somewhere in the backcountry and that traditional rescue methods had failed. The wolf would only respond to human presence, and specifically seemed to be calling for Michael. By dawn, he was at the park's research station, where he found Dr. Rodriguez coordinating with a team of veterinarians and park rangers. Her face was drawn with exhaustion and worry as she briefed him on the situation. Phantom got caught in one of Diesel's old snares, she explained, pointing to a topographic map marked with red X's. We found 12 more trap sites that Bobby didn't tell us about during the trial. This one was hidden in a ravine about 8 miles from where you two first met. Michael studied the map, his military training automatically calculating approach routes and potential obstacles. How long has he been trapped? At least 36 hours, maybe longer. We've tried tranquilizer darts, but he's positioned himself where we can't get a clear shot. Every time we approach, he struggles harder against the snare. At this point, we're worried he's going to strangle himself or break his leg. Ranger Jim Whitehorse joined the conversation, his weathered face grim. I've seen animals die from snares like this. The more they fight, the tighter the cable gets. Your wolf is strong, but he's been at this for over a day. He's exhausted and dehydrated. The word "your" wasn't lost on Michael. Somehow, in the 3 weeks since the trial, Phantom had become his responsibility, his connection to something larger than his own damaged psyche. What makes you think he'll respond to me? Dr. Rodriguez played an audio recording on her tablet. Through the static came a sound that made Michael's heart clench, a long, mournful howl that seemed to carry all the loneliness in the world. He's been making that call every few hours since yesterday. It's not a territorial howl or a hunting signal. It's the sound wolves make when they're calling for their pack. He's calling for you, Ranger Whitehorse said quietly. Question is, are you willing to answer? 2 hours later, Michael was hiking through terrain that had become painfully familiar. The same ridges and valleys where he'd nearly died, where Phantom had saved his life, now held his protector prisoner. The irony wasn't lost on him. The wolf who had freed him from Diesel's ropes was now bound by Diesel's trap. The rescue team followed at a distance, giving Michael space to approach alone. Dr. Rodriguez had equipped him with a radio and basic veterinary supplies, but they all knew this would come down to trust between man and wolf, not technology or medical expertise. He heard Phantom before he saw him, a low whine that spoke of pain and frustration. Following the sound, Michael approached the edge of a steep ravine and looked down into a natural depression surrounded by thick brush. There, 40 feet below, lay the wolf who had become the most important creature in his world. Phantom was caught by a steel cable around his right front leg, the snare attached to a heavy log that prevented escape. The wolf had worn a circular path in the earth around his anchor point, and Michael could see where repeated struggles had rubbed the fur away from his leg. Blood stained the cable and the ground beneath it. When Phantom saw Michael, his reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. The exhausted animal struggled to his feet and let out a whine that seemed to say, "I knew you would come." His tail attempted a weak wag, but pain and exhaustion made even that simple gesture difficult. "I'm here, boy," Michael called down, his voice thick with emotion. "Hold on, I'm coming to get you." The descent into the ravine was treacherous, requiring Michael to rappel down a makeshift rope system the Rangers had rigged earlier. Every movement sent loose rocks cascading down, and Michael held his breath each time, fearing the noise would spook Phantom into further struggles. When he finally reached the bottom, Michael moved slowly, keeping his voice low and reassuring. Phantom watched his approach with eyes that held pain, but no fear. The wolf trusted him completely, even in his agony. Up close, the damage was worse than Michael had feared. The steel cable had cut deep into Phantom's leg, and infection was setting in around the wound. The wolf was severely dehydrated, his tongue hanging out as he panted in the morning heat. "Easy, buddy," Michael whispered, kneeling beside the trapped animal. "Let me see what we're dealing with here." The snare was a professional model designed to tighten under pressure, but nearly impossible to loosen once triggered. Michael examined the mechanism while Phantom lay still, somehow understanding that this human was trying to help rather than harm. Using tools the veterinary team had provided, Michael worked at the cable's locking mechanism. The process was delicate. Too much force would trigger the snare to tighten further, potentially severing Phantom's leg entirely. Sweat dripped into his eyes as he manipulated the tiny components, his fingers cramping from the precision work. "Talk to me, Michael," Dr. Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio. "How's it looking down there?" "Bad," Michael replied, without taking his eyes off his work. "The infection is spreading, and he's lost a lot of blood. Even if I get him free, he's going to need immediate medical attention." Phantom seemed to sense the gravity of his situation. The wolf rested his massive head against Michael's shoulder, a gesture of complete trust that made Michael's hands tremble with emotion. Here was an apex predator, weakened and vulnerable, choosing to place his faith in a human rather than his own instincts. "Why?" Michael whispered as he continued working on the snare. "Why did you trust me that first night? Why risk your life to save mine?" As if in answer, Phantom lifted his head and looked directly into Michael's eyes. What Michael saw there wasn't the simple intelligence of a clever animal, but something deeper: recognition, empathy, understanding. They were both survivors of trauma, both carrying scars that went deeper than skin. In that moment of eye contact, Michael understood that their bond had been forged not just by circumstance, but by a shared experience of loss and the mutual recognition of wounded souls. The snare mechanism finally gave way with a soft click. Michael carefully worked the cable free from Phantom's leg, the wolf remaining perfectly still despite what must have been excruciating pain. As soon as he was free, Phantom tried to stand but collapsed immediately, his injured leg unable to bear weight. "We need that veterinary team down here now," Michael radioed. "He's free, but he's in bad shape." What happened next would stay with Michael for the rest of his life. As he waited for help to arrive, Phantom struggled to position himself between Michael and the ravine entrance despite his injuries. Even weakened and in agony, the wolf's first instinct was to protect the human who had saved him. "No, boy," Michael said gently, easing Phantom back down. "I'm the one protecting you now. Rest. Let me take care of you for once." For the first time since Michael had known him, Phantom relaxed completely, trusting another being to stand guard while he was vulnerable. It was a level of trust that most humans never achieved with each other, let alone between species. As the veterinary team rappelled into the ravine with medical equipment, Dr. Rodriguez called down from above. "Michael, you should know, we found evidence of at least 6 more poachers working in the park. Diesel's operation was bigger than we thought, and they're not happy about the convictions. There have been threats." Michael looked down at Phantom, who was now unconscious as the veterinarians worked to stabilize him. The wolf had risked everything to save a stranger, and that act of courage had revealed a criminal conspiracy that threatened the entire ecosystem. Now both of them were targets, because they had chosen to do what was right. "Then we'll face it together," Michael said quietly, his hand resting gently on Phantom's uninjured flank, just like before. The wolf's breathing steadied under the veterinarian's care, and Michael felt a spark of hope. They had survived Diesel's traps, both physical and legal. Whatever came next, they would face it as they had faced everything else, as an unlikely pack of two bound by trust that transcended the boundaries between human and wild. But as the rescue team prepared to lift Phantom out of the ravine, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that their greatest challenge still lay ahead. The bond that had saved both their lives was about to be tested in ways neither of them could imagine. 6 months later, spring had returned to Yellowstone with a vengeance. The meadows blazed with wildflowers, and the sound of rushing water from snowmelt filled the valleys with music that seemed to celebrate renewal and second chances. Michael Thompson stood at the edge of the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center's release compound, watching Phantom move with increasing confidence on his healed leg. The wolf's recovery had been nothing short of miraculous. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the wildlife veterinarian who had performed the surgery, later told Michael she'd never seen an animal with such determination to heal. "It was like he knew he had something important to live for," she'd said. "Most wild animals give up when they're confined this long. Phantom fought for every day of recovery." The rehabilitation process had tested their bond in unexpected ways. Federal wildlife regulations prohibited Michael from direct contact with Phantom during treatment, but the wolf's distress when separated from his human companion had been so severe that Dr. Rodriguez had petitioned for special accommodation. Michael was allowed to visit daily, sitting outside the enclosure where Phantom could see and smell him, providing the comfort of pack presence without interfering with medical care. During those long months, Michael had undergone his own transformation. The book he'd written about their experience, Phantom's Choice, When Wilderness Chose Trust Over Fear, had become an unexpected bestseller. But more importantly, the process of writing had helped him process his own trauma in ways that years of traditional therapy had not achieved. The Veterans Administration had taken notice of his progress and asked him to develop a pilot program using wildlife photography as therapy for combat veterans struggling with PTSD. The program, called Wild Focus, paired veterans with experienced nature photographers for extended wilderness expeditions designed to rebuild their sense of purpose and connection to life. "The principle is simple," Michael had explained to the VA committee. "When you're focused on capturing the beauty and dignity of wild creatures, you remember that life has value beyond survival. You start seeing yourself as a protector rather than a victim." The program's first group of participants had included Bobby Crane, who'd been released on parole after serving 18 months of his sentence. The former poacher had struggled with depression and guilt over his role in the wildlife crimes, but working with Michael to document wolf behavior had given him a new perspective on the animals he'd once helped destroy. "I used to see them as enemies," Bobby told Michael during one of their photography sessions. "Now I see them as survivors, just like us." Every scar tells a story of refusing to give up. The legal consequences of the poaching ring had continued to unfold throughout Phantom's recovery. Federal investigators had uncovered a network spanning 3 states with connections to international wildlife trafficking organizations. Diesel Morrison remained in federal prison, but his conviction had triggered a broader crackdown on illegal wildlife trade that had saved countless animals. Dr. Rodriguez had used the attention surrounding Phantom's case to secure funding for a comprehensive study of wolf intelligence and emotional capacity. Her research team, now including Michael as a field consultant, had documented similar cases of extraordinary wolf behavior across North America. The scientific community was slowly acknowledging that these animals possessed cognitive abilities far beyond previously accepted parameters. What Phantom demonstrated wasn't anomalous behavior, Dr. Rodriguez explained to Michael as they prepared for the release ceremony. It was evolutionary behavior that we simply hadn't recognized before. Wolves have been developing these capabilities for millennia. We just weren't paying attention. The media attention had been overwhelming at first. News crews from around the world had descended on Yellowstone to document the miracle wolf and his human friend. Michael had initially resented the intrusion, but he'd come to understand that their story served a larger purpose. Every interview, every photograph, every news segment helped change public perception of predators and the importance of wildlife conservation. On the morning of Phantom's release, Michael arrived at the compound before dawn to find the wolf waiting by the gate, as if he understood that this day would be different. The animal's coat had grown back thick and lustrous during his recovery, and the confidence in his golden eyes spoke of a spirit that trauma had tested but not broken. Dr. Mitchell performed one final medical examination, pronouncing Phantom fit for return to the wild. "His leg is fully healed, and all his vitals are excellent," she reported to the assembled team of researchers, park officials, and media representatives. "Physiologically, he's ready to resume his life as a wild wolf." But everyone present understood that the real question wasn't about physical readiness. It was about whether the bond between man and wolf would survive their return to their respective worlds. Ranger Jim Whitehorse, who had become an unexpected advocate for wolf protection following the events of the previous year, approached Michael as the release preparations began. "You know there's no guarantee you'll see him again once we open that gate," he said quietly. "Wild animals don't maintain friendships with humans, no matter how strong the connection seems in captivity." Michael nodded, understanding the reality but hoping for something more. "I know. But that's not why we're doing this. We're doing it because he deserves to be free, regardless of whether he chooses to remember me." The ceremony itself was simple. No speeches, no fanfare, just the quiet opening of a gate that would return one of nature's most magnificent creatures to his rightful place in the ecosystem. Michael was given the honor of unlatching the enclosure, his hands trembling slightly as he worked the mechanism. Phantom approached the open gate cautiously, testing the air with his keen senses. For a moment, he looked back at Michael with an expression that seemed to carry gratitude, understanding, and perhaps even love. Then, without hesitation, he padded through the opening and began walking toward the tree line. The assembled crowd held its breath as the wolf reached the edge of the forest. This was the moment that would define everything. Would Phantom disappear into the wilderness forever, or would he acknowledge the human who had saved his life? At the forest's edge, Phantom stopped and turned. His golden eyes found Michael across the 50 yards of meadow that separated them, and for a long moment, predator and human simply looked at each other. Then Phantom threw back his scarred head and released a howl that seemed to contain all the wildness and wisdom of the mountains themselves. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, carried by wind and memory into every corner of the vast wilderness. It was a song of freedom, of survival, of the unbreakable bonds that can form between unlikely allies. When the echo faded, Phantom turned and vanished into the forest, leaving behind only the memory of his voice and the promise of his presence in the wild spaces he called home. Over the following months, there were occasional sightings of a large gray wolf in the area where Michael and Phantom had first met. Hikers reported encounters with an unusually calm animal that showed no fear of humans but maintained respectful distance. Park cameras occasionally captured images of a scarred wolf leading a small pack through territories that bordered human activity areas. Michael continued his work with the Wild Focus program, leading wounded veterans into the wilderness to find healing through connection with nature. On clear mornings, when the light was just right and the forest seemed to hum with ancient wisdom, he would sometimes hear a distant howl that sounded familiar. Whether it was Phantom's voice or simply the song of the wilderness itself didn't matter. What mattered was the knowledge that somewhere in those mountains, a wolf who had chosen trust over fear continued to live free, carrying with him the proof that even the deepest divisions between species could be bridged by compassion, courage, and hope. The story of Michael Thompson and Wolf 1247M had become legend, inspiring a new generation of conservationists and challenging humanity's understanding of its relationship with the natural world. But for Michael, the real victory wasn't in the books sold or the programs created or the laws changed. The real victory was in knowing that when given the choice between fear and trust, between isolation and connection, between survival and sacrifice, both man and wolf had chosen love. And in that choice, they had discovered that the wilderness contained not just beauty and danger, but wisdom about what it truly means to be alive. As the sun set over Yellowstone that evening, painting the sky in shades of gold that matched a pair of wolf eyes Michael would never forget, he understood that some bonds transcend the boundaries between species, between wild and tame, between human and nature. They become part of the eternal story of life on Earth, a story written in starlight and howls, in courage and compassion, in the endless dance between civilization and wilderness that defines our shared home on this remarkable planet. The wolf had found the tourist tied to a tree, and instead of attacking, had done the unthinkable. He had chosen hope over fear, trust over instinct, love over survival. In doing so, he had saved not just one man's life, but had opened a window into possibilities that scientists are still working to understand. And somewhere in the vast wilderness of Yellowstone, that choice continues to echo in every wind-carried howl that reminds us we are not alone in this world. After decades of raising families, building careers, and weathering life's storms, many of us wonder if our most meaningful chapters have already been written. Michael Thompson thought the same thing at 42, carrying invisible wounds from war and convinced his best days were behind him. But in the darkest moment of his life, tied to a tree and left for dead, something extraordinary happened. A scarred wolf chose compassion over instinct, trust over fear, and in doing so, revealed that second chances can come from the most unexpected places. This story reminds us that it's never too late for transformation, that healing doesn't have an expiration date, and that purpose can find us even when we've stopped looking for it. Michael's encounter with Phantom didn't just save his life, it gave him a new mission helping other veterans heal through nature photography. Sometimes our greatest trials become the foundation for our most important contributions. The wilderness taught both man and wolf that damaged doesn't mean defeated, that scars can become sources of strength, and that the capacity for hope lives within us no matter how deep our wounds. Have you ever had an unexpected encounter that changed your perspective on life? What animal or moment in nature has touched your heart in ways you didn't expect? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.